My name is Tracy Vanderpool. I work for the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and I provide inspection services for the state's fruits and vegetables shipping point inspection and terminal market inspection. And I was asked to come today to the conference to give some information on the producer interest concerning produce safety, specifically development of food safety plans. The growers are very interactive with the school systems, and it's a very important component to make sure that the safety of the food we give our kids is paramount in the whole project.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Wall, and I'm the Produce Safety Alliance Coordinator at Cornell University. And I think that food safety right now is critically important to all growers, not just small growers, not just big growers, but everybody out there. It's something that people need to be aware of.
So before we get started, guys, a couple of things I want to make sure that you understand is when you leave here today, there's going to be a lot more questions probably than answers, but use us as resources, and we're going to provide you with a workbook, and we're going to go through some exercises before today's presentation's over that'll give you, when you go home, it's going to be like, well, what were they talking about there? You should be able to refer to it in the workbook, so don't feel panicky that you didn't catch what we said. Also, you see with this stuff, we're going to have this available on the internet site also. And then another thing is, if when you leave here, hopefully you'll understand that on the food safety arena side, if you're a producer, and we're going to ask you kind of what your backgrounds are, but if you're a producer and you're new to this, or you're an institution and you're new to it, you leave here with a better understanding that about 95% what's required in a food safety plan or development is already being done, guys. Maybe the documentation's not there, maybe the record keeping's not there, but we provide very safe food in the United States and in Colorado in general, and not a lot of people get sick very often, so the system's good. The systems that are in place are good. Now, some of the documentation and record keeping may be a little bit lax, but that's where these food safety plans should help pick stuff like that up. So with that, let's get started. Today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of food safety, why it's here, why it may pertain to you, where you start with responsibility and research, development of a food safety plan. We're going to talk quite a bit about risk assessments, and we're going to do a couple of drills on that. The implementation of a food safety plan after you come up with the actual documentation of the plan. And as small as this group is, I don't know how many of you were here last year, but it was very, very hard to discuss anything because we were in a big room like that and we were separated out into spokes, and it was really hard to interact. Very intimate setting here, guys. So what we want to do is we want to keep this very informal, and we'll take questions as we go. That way you can address those questions, and the questions that come up because of those answers, we hope to be able to touch on those as we go through this. So that's the agenda. The history of food safety. Consumers expect safe food. That's pretty self-evident. Well, from that perspective, the producers are responsible. As producers, you guys are the ones that grow the food. You're responsible for that. Any adulteration that happens after that could contaminate the food, unless you guys can prove different, it's going to be your responsibility and it's going to be your liability as producers. More reported outbreaks. I'm going to let Gretchen talk a little bit about this, of why. But one thing as we go through this, I want you to remember is that today's information technology has changed this paradigm in the last 5 years tremendously.
So why? Why now? Why are we hearing about all these foodborne illnesses? Well, science. A lot of what science does now is enables us to track pathogens back to where they originated. There's a lot of really cool technologies and things that I could probably go on hours about. But the science is really interesting, and it brings up a lot of issues that we never knew about in the past. Also, the distribution system. Our products, although this conference is more focused on local, our products are going nationally, internationally. They're going all over the place. They're getting commingled. The distribution system is just so complex that it creates different types of issues that we've never seen before. And then other factors, the age of the population. The fact is we have an aging population, and a lot of that population, the older people, they have compromised immune systems. They are more likely to get illnesses. The health of our population, we've got a lot of people that are immunocompromised, people with AIDS, people that have, kidney transplants. Those people are more at risk for becoming ill with foodborne illness than the rest of us. Also, consumer choices. Everyone's harping, you got to eat healthier, especially in Colorado. You guys should know this. There's a real big push to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, and because of that, there should be more of an emphasis placed on the food safety of those products. And then lastly, changing microorganisms, and that goes back to the science. We didn't start seeing E. coli 0157H7 until just 10 or so years ago. These microorganisms change according to their environment, and you never know when these microorganisms might change and cause more people to become ill.
So what should food safety mean to me as a producer? The biggest thing is you guys are responsible as producers. So you got to be proactive in knowing what you have to know to make sure you're following good agricultural practices. And bottom line, guys, is you know your production systems and your farming methods better than anybody else. So before we get into a situation where we're having just a constant breakdown with crises, it's a lot better that you guys take responsibility as producers now, because you guys know your operation rather than the government come down and tell you, you have to do this. Because they're going to write rules because they have to, and their legislative bodies that dictate what they do will do it from this altitude as opposed to down here. Be proactive, stay up with your extension agents. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. But you guys in Colorado have a very special relationship with the university, especially CSU, those extension agents. They know you guys intimately, your growing region and your practices. They're the first go-to for any resource information. Guys, the biggest thing so far in this history kind of recap is following can be dangerous. From my experience as a third-party auditor and supervisor, early on in this game, what we saw was a lot of food safety plans just being passed across from grower to grower. They weren't grower specific, very dangerous, guys. Every plan has to be specific to that growing operation. There's brothers that farm, but they farm different. They might use components that are exactly the same, but they use them different. So be very, very cautious of just picking an off-the-shelf plan and just putting your name on it and you're going. There is no such a thing, okay? Don't get caught using these excuses. I've been farming for 75 years and never had a problem. Man, it could be tomorrow. Knock on wood that it hasn't happened. Implementation of a food safety program is too expensive. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we get into some of the audit providers and how that works. But I hope to show you that most of what you do is already being done, so there's not a lot of cost associated with that. You're never too small of a producer. It doesn't matter whether you're going across the fence to your neighbor or across the world to another retail buyer. It can happen to anybody. The reality is that food-related problems can happen to anyone. Pathogens exist everywhere. And this is kind of where some of Gretchen's expertise comes in, so she'll be interjecting in some of this. All growers use these components. Typically, guys, this water component right here, people and environment are huge, because those are the means of the vector, if you will, that'll microbacterially contaminate your foods. Pathogens don't care where you're located, how big you are, the commodity that you are, or who consumes the product. So it's a real problem for everybody. We're a little bit lax, again, in this area because we don't have a lot of food safety outbreak issues, but that's because of good agricultural practices that are being practiced every day. But we can't let our guard down just because of that. One person sick is too many. It's obvious. So you guys got to stay on top of things. Hopefully, if we can help you with a food safety plan, the development of that'll just keep that in the forefront of this whole mindset. Something that's really changed things, guys, Gretchen talked a little bit about the outbreaks, and we've always had foodborne outbreaks, but they were never tied together as efficiently as they are today. We didn't have the means communication-wise or computer access-wise. Today, they can put it in a database somewhere in the Indies, and we can find out about it instantaneously right here. So those things have really changed things. Used to be TV and radio and newspaper. Well, you know how long it takes to get information out. Plus, your distribution might have been only local, maybe regional, but very seldom did it leave the state. Today we have the internet and social media. There's probably people seeing us on this camera before we're even in front of the camera, actually. Impacts consumer confidence. The consumer knows more than he ever did. Sometimes he knows more than he needs to know because he doesn't have all the information, but he has enough to be dangerous, if you will. Consumption. We saw it with this cantaloupe crisis this past summer. As soon as that hit, it didn't matter if you were a melon grower in California or on the East Coast, it affected your market. Litigation now, obviously it's always somebody else's fault, so there's going to be some actions there. Brand protection, a lot of you guys, and we'll talk about this in depth, you've done a lot of good communication to build a reputation and build a brand. It can be impacted very easily with today's communication methods. And produce and buyer relationships. Typically, those used to just be through sales and direct contact. Well, today, those retailers are hearing stuff about you from backdoor situations with the way technology is through some of the social media and internet sites. So if we have time, we're going to talk a little bit about some crisis management, which includes communication. And that's huge as far as on the proactive side before there's a problem, how you want to build your reputation and share your food safety plans and your processes before you get in trouble. Why have a food safety plan or program? Priorities, what does it mean to me? Obviously, consumer protection is number one. One person sick is too many. Business asset protection, we talked about this a little bit. If you are producers in this room, many of you may be second, third, fourth generation producers that have come up. Everything you do is because you love it, and that's how you make your living. So it's very important that you protect those assets. Regulatory, Gretchen's going to talk a lot more specific detail about the Food Safety Modernization Act, but before we get into that, I kind of want to talk to you guys a little bit about this mandatory versus non-mandatory. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed last year through our Congress and President Obama, which put into place directing responsibility to FDA to come up with some rules and regulations to help promote good agricultural practices, the thoughts behind what do we have to do to make sure our food supplies are safe. But before that happened last year, we had some issues. Where this kind of came from is we started doing food safety audits in Colorado in the early 2000s. And typically, guys, they were all retail driven, which in my perspective, looking back now, was the tail wagging the dog. What was happening then is people were trying to pass a third-party audit or get some type of certification to meet the requirements of that buyer, whether it was the retail side, whether it was a school, whoever it was. So the producers, in turn, they just wanted certified, and they wanted it yesterday. So they kind of lost the thought that, okay, why do I have a food safety plan? Well, what's the point of it? They just wanted to get that certification so they could pass that on to the buyer, and then they were okay. On the buyer's perspective, it was all about accountability. As long as I put that off on the producer, I'm good. You know, if somebody goes to sue me because I make somebody sick that bought melons that I bought from Mexico, that's their fault. It's not my fault because I required them to have this certification. They passed that. I did all I could do. But we're seeing that's changing a little bit today. Everybody's liable within that chain. It's a lot more farm to fork, if you will. But that's what started this whole thing. So a lot of people put plans in place that they bought off the shelf, just slammed them into their program, put their name on it, and they were good to go. Well, those weren't really adequate food safety plans. So if you guys are familiar at all with the melon incident that happened in the Arkansas Valley this last year, very, very unfortunate. I mean, people died over that, which is horrible, guys. That's the worst case scenario that's out there. But one of the things that was noted was that maybe we need to take a little bit harder look at not only the food safety plan, but also those tools that we use to review those plans. Now, if any of you guys are familiar with that, one of the things that came out of the findings was that they had a food safety plan, but we're not sure, but there's a lot of talk that maybe it was used just to pass an audit. They didn't practice it every day, and we're going to really show you why that's important. The other thing that come up was they had a third-party audit, give them a score, but a couple of issues with that. One is that audit comes in, and we're going to kind of show you some reasons of why, how you should use an audit, but they give them a score and a passing grade. Well, the score was really good. It was a 96. But from a consumer perspective, this is me not knowing what I know. What about the 4% they didn't get? what's that do to me if I get part of that 4%, or what was it? So from a consumer perspective, that's a little bit scary. On the others, another thing that happened was that there was maybe some conflict of interest there. They changed their processes, which was advised by the same company that did their audit. It wasn't actually an independent third-party audit. So we're going to show you how these audits should work and a tool that you use. But one of the things I got to change in through the people that we have here, how you identified yourselves, we have got to get the word out to the consumer that just because you have a third-party audit or an internal audit or you do a self-audit, it's just a tool to see how your food safety plan's working. It is not, I passed it, we're good, and we're gone. You know, because stuff can still happen. This is an everyday thing. Those audits only are conducted for 4 to 6 hours in an annual period, where the production may last 120 days. In some facilities, they're year-round. So we're kind of backwards. It's that tail wagging the dog thing, like I explained before. We have the requests coming in for certification, but we're training to the test as opposed to using it every day and trying to learn something from it.
I think that's a really good segue into what I'm doing with the Produce Safety Alliance and what's going on with current regulations, because we're trying to educate farmers before the regulations come out. So we're not teaching to the test, and we're not teaching to specific audiences or audits, but instead preparing you to really implement these practices on your farm and not just say that you're going to do it. So I'm going to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act. Who here is familiar, just by a show of hands, or has heard of the Food Safety Modernization Act? How many of you wish that you had never heard of it? It's not all that scary, believe me. We have direct ties to the people writing these regulations, and I'm just going to try to break it down to what their current thinking is. This was passed last year on January 4th, and right now they're still waiting to release the draft version. They had set a goal date of January 4th of 2012, and of course that didn't happen. It's tied up in Office of Budget and Management right now, but it really is a regulation, or a series of regulations that's focused on prevention, not detection. So we're not, focusing on detecting pathogens after they're already there. We're trying to prevent them to begin with. But there's 6 major areas of FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, that kind of encompass a lot of different things. The production side, so there's food preventative controls for production facilities, feed preventative controls, prevention of intentional contamination of the food supply, sanitary transportation, foreign supplier verification, and then the last one that I'm specifically going to talk about today is the produce safety piece. So that's the focus on the growing, harvesting, and post-harvest handling of our produce. So what's the time frame? I already said that the regulation is anticipated for early 2012. That's what they always say, early. So hopefully it'll be here in the next month or so. They've really been working hard on it. But what does that mean to you? So it comes out, there's this draft, and there will be a 75-day comment period where you can go on their website, and the website link is there at the bottom. You can see all of their implementation timelines, what they're up to. I believe the dockets for comment will be on there for 75 days. And then they are required to hold 3 meetings across the country, listening sessions basically, to get grower inputs on this regulation. And then once they finally close that period, it'll be 1 year before they start to enact all these rules. So they still have yet to define these categories, but they have to break them out by very small farm, small farms, and then all others. So once the draft comes out, we'll really get to see what they mean by very small or small. We have some idea of what that is, but I'll try to explain that as part of the tester amendment. But for very small farms, they're going to have a little bit more leeway in implementing these things. There's specific challenges that small farmers face that some large farmers might have more resources to handle. So very small farms have a little bit more time than small farms, 2 years, and then all others 1 year after the final rule is issued. So what's the tester amendment? I mentioned that there's this possible exemption for small growers, and the tester amendment is directed at growers that direct market more than 50% of their products, have gross sales of all food and food products of less than 500,000. I believe that's an average over 3 years. So if you average under that, and they sell direct within 275 miles of the area where it was grown. So those are some of the criteria to be exempt by the Tester Amendment. But what I want to point out, and I'll talk about it a little bit in a later slide, is even though if you're a small grower, you might be exempt, if there ends up being a problem on your farm and they have to come back and there's a foodborne illness that's traced back to your farm, they have the ability to pull back that exemption. So you'll still be under the umbrella of all the FSMA regulations.
Plus, let me interject something there, Gretchen. Guys, that's kind of the point I tried to make earlier, is that even though there's going to be legal exemptions to some of the rules that we see coming out, we still want to keep in mind it's about people, it's about the product that you provide, so we want to make sure that those food safety plans keep everybody safe. Legally, yeah, you might be exempt. If I'm exempt from 200 miles an hour on the highway, am I still dangerous? There's a possibility that we can hurt somebody, so.
I also want to point out that this is the FDA's current thinking. As much as I work with them on a daily basis, I have no clue what's actually going to be in this draft rule, but they've given several presentations to us about their current thinking and how the regulation has been structured. So in terms of specific produce commodities, there's 3 categories: in scope, out of scope, and then in scope but exempt. So things that are in scope of the regulations are fresh fruits and vegetables, mushrooms, sprouts have had a reoccurring problem with foodborne illness outbreaks, and then peanuts and tree nuts, which are not normally what you would consider fresh produce, but if you remember the Peanut Corporation of America, that outbreak, that was huge. So those are all in scope items. In scope but exempt items would be those people that are under the Tester Amendment, which I mentioned could be pulled back if you are implicated in a foodborne illness outbreak, or commodities which you normally consume cooked. So, I don't know how many of you eat raw potatoes or raw artichokes, but it's kind of that thinking. If you're going to cook it, you're going to be killing whatever bacteria might potentially be harmful. So those are exempt. Things that are totally out of scope are things that are destined for a kill step processing, which would be like Roma tomatoes for tomato paste. Something that's going to be highly processed, subject to a heat treatment. It'll be canned, it'll be treated so that there's no pathogens in that product. Also, agronomic crops such as grain, rice, those aren't going to be part of the regulation. Does anybody have any questions?
If you fall under the Tester Amendment exemption and you get pulled back or drawn into this in scope, is it retroactive or would it be?
That's a good question. I think if you were implicated in a foodborne illness, I think once that happens, I don't think that you're eligible to be under that exemption again, but I could be wrong.
If you're that small, you'd be done. Lawsuit.
Exactly. Yeah, so if that is the case, then,
From what we understand, it's going to pull the exemption status that you would qualify for because you meet some of the requirements, but that's still yet to be determined by rule. But that's what it looks like, is you'll be exempt if you fit their criteria. But if you do have an incident, they'll pull your ability to be within that exemption.
And is that an incident, or is it do you have a USDA inspector come in and you fall out of the good graces because of certain food safety aspects? Or does it have to actually be an incident that?
Well, it could be that they have an inspector come in and you don't follow the rules that you should be following, but you'll be exempt from those inspections, so the possibility of that happening is so rare that it's probably going to be an outbreak or some relation to
it'll probably be a
generate that
contamination event where they'd be tracing it back to your farm. They likely aren't going to come on your farm and audit you because you're exempt. Yeah. Sure.
To qualified end users, what's the definition of qualified end users?
I don't believe that that's out. A lot of this is their current thinking and what they're allowed to release to us right now. I'm sure there is going to be a definition in the final rule. I believe the qualified end user would be someone within that 275-mile radius, but that's a good question. I'm not sure what the definition of that is.
I do know that they're considering institutional buyers in that qualified user, because that's different than just a local consumer or retail group. So I know that's under consideration, but that's why we're all holding our breaths waiting to see what these rules are, to see what those definitions are.
Yeah, I just wondered, does that include farmers markets or is that like restaurants?
Yeah, we'll see here shortly, hopefully. The other piece to this regulation is that it's really focused on risk-based practices. So I know we haven't gone into the full background of good agricultural practices, but on the farm there are certain production practices that are riskier. And we know that because of science, we know that because of outbreaks and how they've occurred. For instance, if you're irrigating with a surface water that is open to, a cattle feedlot operation, there's a very high chance, a higher chance that water would be contaminated versus a municipal water source. So the focus of this regulation is on practices, and there's a higher both regulatory burden and burden to basically the farmer. If you're using a higher risk practice, there's a higher risk that your produce is going to be contaminated. So it's trying to push farmers to think about their practices and try to move them towards lower risk practices. Your question?
Do you have any idea how hydroponics would play into this?
I don't. You have any information on hydroponics?
Well, what we know right now through the work that we're doing with third-party audits on the government side and what they're trying to make us do is that you'll be required to just follow those same risk-based approaches. So you're still using water, but the contact surfaces are different. You don't have a soil medium typically. So they'll refer back to your best practices and where that comes from. So they won't dictate a lot about that. Gretchen, can you talk to them a little bit about this risk-based approach compared to a HACCP plan approach?
Do you guys know what HACCP is? I don't want to introduce HACCP if you're not familiar. HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, and HACCP is often used in production, where there's a critical control point where there's absolutely not going to be any pathogens or bacteria left in that product. Obviously, on a farm, you're never going to get to that level. I don't think anybody wants to eat a head of lettuce that has been liquefied into, whatever to heat it up. I mean, there's just no way, because it's out in the environment and it's open to animals, it's open to the soil, that you're ever going to get 100% zero risk on a farm. So the difference...
And when that happens, what do you do on a farm? Do you disc everything? Because we know, like, potatoes are growing in the dirt. You're going to pick up certain things that might be not acceptable microbacterially, but they're at such low levels and they're always there that it's not a harm to us. But if you're running a test for that specifically and you find it, then what do? I mean, you're tying your hands really tight. So a HACCP plan is way different than what we're talking about here in these plans.
Yeah.
So it's an give gap, right?
Excuse me?
Yeah, we're talking specifically about good agricultural practices and good handling practices.
The key, guys, is what she talked about earlier, prevention, as opposed to we're testing at different points to see where we're at. HACCP, I mean, you can tie it to the manufacturing of, like, bolts, and at some point you check the hardness of them, they're too soft, you just throw those away. Where this is more prevention, we're trying to keep it from happening to start with. We're not just going to grow the crop the whole year and then at the very end just run a swab test and go, oh, none of it's good. I mean, practically as a grower, you can't do that.
The place I'm confused with this is that SQF refers to HACCP as being an important criteria. So now
that's processing though.
Yeah. HACCP is used for processing facilities. There's just no feasible way that you could ever implement a HACCP plan on a farm, because at some point at that farm you'd have to have some step where you could say absolutely no, there's no pathogens in this product, and we can never do that, unfortunately.
Well, HACCP is basically just an identifying point of a critical control point. It's not liquid. It's, from what I understand of it, you're just identifying where the parts in your process, whether it's grow out or processing, that is a danger point.
But you typically have to do a validation test of some type at that point to see where you're at with whatever tolerance would be allowable, where we're not talking about that with a good agricultural plan. Now, you bring up a good point, and we'll talk about like SQF and SCS and some of the other audits that are available out there. That's a component we'll talk about a little bit later, but you're going to have the choice typically of who's going to do that audit. You're going to want to make that audit provider fit what your goals are. You know, we're seeing a lot now with this global food initiative, a lot of sustainability. Well, for the guy that's going to the local school here, can he pass that? And does it matter? Probably not. So one of the things we've got to try and educate you guys on, and you know this better than I do, is you need to talk to those people that are buying your product, and when they say, we only accept this type of audit or this type of certification, you need to share with them what you know as growers so that they understand that, well, that doesn't apply. And it's like, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Thanks for recognizing that. Because right now, they're just throwing you all under this umbrella that says, we require this for any producers that are selling to us. And you know what? Produce is, I mean, that's why we have produces for the variety. We don't all just eat carrots. We don't all just eat broccoli. It's the variety of things. Umbrella rules don't fit everything. So we've got to change that thought on the other end. You know, that's that tail wagging the dog again. They're dictating what they have or what they have to have from you, and it's impossible for you to provide that. So if you guys come up with these plans, like we're going to kind of just introductorily show you today, you can share those plans with those buyers so they have a better understanding of what you do, why you do it, and what you can and cannot do. So we can see them maybe change their thoughts on, you know, maybe we should allow different food safety plans or different audits to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to.
I'm going to skip over this slide and come back to it, but I want to introduce the Produce Safety Alliance. I've mentioned it a couple times, and I'm the program coordinator for the Alliance, but it's based out of Cornell. It was a $1.15 million grant that was provided in conjunction with FDA and USDA, and it's really it focuses on prevention and the outreach and education pieces of all of this, and it's a program that's meant to educate producers like yourselves before this regulation happens and before the regulation comes down, to prepare you instead of the government just coming and saying you have to do this. It really goes to show FDA and USDA's commitment. They want to educate before they regulate. So this program is currently in the development stages. This summer, we held almost, I think, 60 committee meetings with growers from all over the country. Not only growers, but educators, anybody that has any interest in produce safety. They all came to these discussions that were held by conference call, and we discussed the challenges of implementing GAPS on the farm with a specific focus on small and very small growers, because they really do see some different types of challenges than a large grower might. But we definitely don't exclude anyone from this program or our curriculum, because it's meant to be a nationally recognized curriculum in the end. So our working committee process is wrapping up right now. Those working committees, which I believe there are 170 or so members of the working committees, they are putting out final reports, and our executive committee will be reviewing them. And then we take all of those responses, all of those meetings that we held, and create a curriculum based on all of those comments. So the final draft curriculum will be done sometime midsummer, mid to late summer. And then myself and Betsy Bin, who is an extension educator at Cornell, and she runs the National GAPS program, she and I will be going around and doing training sessions for this program. So what can you do right now? We're here harping to you about food safety. I mean, you're well on your way for just coming to this session, but we can only cover so much in a 1.5-hour session. So you need to go out there and educate yourself on food safety. And in the packet that we'll be handing you out later, we have a ton of resources that you can go and look at. Make sure you ask us questions. And the first step is to develop your food safety plan. Whether you're going to go for an audit in the future or not, or whether your buyer is requiring you to go for an audit, you have to have a food safety plan. I'm telling you, get on it now, because it'll just make the whole process a lot easier if you're up to date and educated and know where the resources are when you need them. Now I'll turn it back over to Tracy.
And then kind of one thing to back up on this Produce Safety Alliance, guys. In my world, I wish what the work that Gretchen's doing with this alliance would have came out 15 years ago. And then the buyers would have required food safety plans. We're just backwards, because what she's going to be able to do from her office is she's going to come to Colorado, she's going to come to California, she's going to come to Idaho, and she's going to train extension specialists and people like my staff. And then we're going to go out and we're going to give 2-day workshops to you guys, and we'll sit down and we'll actually do a whole plan, or 2/3 of a plan, but you'll be working on it, but we'll be there as the answers to a lot of the questions that you'll come up with on your own. So what you're going to see today is just the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully if you have to get a plan in place, we're going to be able to show you the tools that you can use, and if you're proactive at it, you'll be able to develop one anyway. I wish we had more time to share with you and we'd get into this a lot more than we're going to, but just know that this is coming, so we're doing the best we can. So as we get to the end, there's a contact page on the back of our presentation in the handbook. Please, I don't care how small the question is, call us personally or drop us an email, and we'll try and walk you through some of this stuff, because we do know that you're behind the 8 ball, and you should have done this first.
Do you offer gift gap classes right now?
We don't, and the problem that the reason why we don't is because we provide the third-party audit services. So for us to give the class and then come out and fail you, there's some conflict of interest issues there.
I can tell you, it's coming down the line with Colorado Extension, for sure. They're contacting me, they're contacting other people that have current programs. I would definitely look to CSU Extension in the near future, because I know they're going to be offering some training sessions.
A lot of other states do already.
So if you go through the audit experience and you fail, by failing, you're not going to be able to produce anything then?
Oh, no. That audit, and we'll get into that in a little bit more depth later, but the audit is just a tool to see how your plan is working. It doesn't, just because you fail doesn't mean you're done and we're going to pull your ag license to sell produce.
So it's a good way to help you to actually help to develop your food safety program, is actually have an audit.
Yep.
So hire a company to come in, audit you, and they're going to kind of take you through all the stuff that you have to get to where you need to be, right?
Correct.
And it's not going to, and it won't prevent you from continuing to do business.
Absolutely not.
Well, I mean,
is that public information?
No, sir.
Okay.
I mean, the repercussion is if your buyer was requesting you to have an audit and then you failed the audit and couldn't provide them with certification.
And the reason I'm saying this is because, I do business with a lot of small growers, and I need to help them, because ultimately I'm going to get to a position where if they don't have this and haven't completed it, then I'm really not going to be able to do business with them. Like there's a grower that I'm doing business with right now that I've been told by corporate I've got to stop because he doesn't have a food safety program in place, and he's kind of wrapped up in the fear of the expense associated with it. And it's kind of like, just go through it, do it. It's okay, and it'll help you to get where you need to be.
Yeah, you're kind of stealing my thunder, what we're going to talk about later. But you're right. One thing we want to change also is this perception of the score, like I talked before, that you had an audit done, you passed. I can tell you guys now, with all the criticism that came out with the audit that was done in the Arkansas Valley on the cantaloupe issue, that we're going to see, to a certain extent, scorable pass audits disappear. We're going to see audits where there's just narratives written on what was observed. And then the receiver of your product, gentlemen like yourself, you'll review that and you'll decide whether, well, is that acceptable for what we're doing? And you'll make the end call. Because right now, I'll be honest with you guys, and from my experience as an auditor and the complaints we get back, the people that are requiring you to have a food safety plan and basically get audit certified, they don't care. As long as you get your name on a website and get a certificate, they don't care what the audit found. And that's wrong, guys. That's totally wrong. That's putting the onus on that 1 6-hour visit on a farm, and that we've got to change that. And it's bad that we have to have a crisis to kind of generate that change. But once you as producers and people like yourself that are on the retail side or the wholesale side, once you identify that it's a tool to protect business asset, consumer protection, we change this whole thought that, hey, I got certified, so I'm good to go and everything is cherry. Once we change that, it's going to be a lot better working relationship.
Does that mean that there'll be more shared responsibility than in terms of that that assertion of safety, because if basically then the vendor who's reviewing that audit is just making a determination, and they're now somehow subject to consideration there too.
More than likely, yes, because bottom line is why is this whole thing happening? That guy wants your product. So if he doesn't help with that to some extent, you're not going to be able to meet his requirements, so then you can't provide him with what he needs. Okay?
Yeah, the outbreak that happened in the Arkansas Valley, traditionally the grower would be really 100% held liable. They're going after everybody. Everybody was involved in the distribution chain. So that's kind of the point that he's making, is that now everybody's got skin in the game. Right. You got skin in the game, the distributor has skin in the game, the retail store has skin in the game, everybody's got skin in the game.
And I don't want to change the subject and get way off course, but a lot of times one of the components of an audit was a mock recall performed, and was it effective? Well, the guy that's requesting you to be certified as a producer, you'll ask him to help you with a mock recall, because a mock recall is, can you get product out of the marketing chain anywhere at any given time? Well, they'll fail that because they'll start a mock recall and they'll go to that retailer, and that retailer goes, I'm not going to help you do that. And from an audit perspective or just a general consumer perspective, I'm like, well, how does that work? You know, this guy wants to make sure that guy's providing him safe food, but he won't help him with the tools that he needs to prove that. And to me, that's just absolutely crazy. So let's go on. Take responsibility and understand your risks. Understanding your risks, guys, that's the beginning of a risk assessment. And as producers, the producers that are in the room, you guys typically know those already. That's just good business practice. If you're a farmer, that's how you're brought up. Kind of an analogy I like to use is, how many of you were told since you can remember to wash your hands before you eat? I'm almost 50 years old, guys, and I still think about that when I go to eat. And I was told a long time ago. So when I know those risks that are associated with me not following those practices. You as growers already know a lot of those practices. Understand that every operation is different. We talked a little bit about that. Be proactive. We talked about that. Stay up with the education on the good agricultural practices. As technology advances, machineries change, those processes change, you got to keep up with those changes to make sure it's still following good agricultural practices. And this is kind of it's a little bit maybe politically incorrect, but I'm going to say this. One of the issues on the Arkansas Valley that they found is they changed a production practice, okay? And it did not follow good agricultural practices. This wasn't something that just fell out of the sky and we're all like, how did that happen? And as a grower, I'm like, I'm done, because I don't know why that happened. I can't prevent it. There was a problem with what they did, and they didn't update or be proactive in keeping up with those agricultural practices. And that could have been one of the sources it looks like it was identified with the outbreak. So just make sure you stay proactive and work at it every day. Once you pass an audit, if that's what you do, or once your buyer accepts your product, if he looks at an audit and says it's good, continue to practice it every day. You got to make it part of your everyday life. Research and guidance, like basically where do you start? Know what you don't know. You guys know an awful lot. The only thing you don't know is how do you coordinate it into a food safety plan. Hopefully that's what we're going to help you do today. Do your homework using general and commodity specific guidance. And I'm going to kind of skip down here. First, guys, if you're a local grower, use those extension specialists. Again, like I talked about before, they know everything about you and the commodities you grow and the area that you grow. For general information, and these are just examples, it's not all inclusive, but you've got FDA, you've got Cornell, you've got UC Davis. Those are very, very prominent university and government facilities or organizations that can give you just general good agricultural practice information. And if we have time, we'll show you a little bit of that on the internet. If we don't, we've got their links in the back of the handout we're going to give you, so visit those. In addition to that, some commodity groups and some businesses actually have come out and they've got specific guidance. So if you go to FDA's website, you're going to find one that just generally covers microbial, bacterial contamination, mitigation processes and good practices to help reduce that. But you can also, if you're a melon grower, you can go and they'll have one just specifically for melons or one specifically for tomatoes. Okay? So if you grow a commodity that's just a specific thing that you can find actual information just on GAP practices or good agricultural practices for that commodity, See if it's out there. Today's search engines, guys, all you got to do is put a few keywords in and it'll pull up more than you can read in your lifetime.
United Fresh
Okay.
is a good resource.
What's that?
United Fresh.
Yes, United Fresh is absolutely a good resource too. Any of the produce companies, PMA's got information out there. Everybody's got it out there. But just know that there's general information, but also look for commodity specific and talk to your local people. Developing a food safety plan, map out your operation. We're going to actually do this exercise a couple of times in here so you can actually feel what that's like. But that's part of your risk assessment. You're going to identify specific risks with that operation, and we're going to practice that. Develop management processes. Basically, the SOPs are what you're going to do to mitigate that risk. Got to document those. And you develop a checklist to say who, where, what is being done. Okay, to show that you're doing these processes. And that's your food safety plan, guys. It's that simple. And I'll guarantee you, as growers in this room, you're doing this, I'll bet you, on everything. You're doing this on probably everything. You have this, but you just haven't documented it. It's part of this. You just maybe haven't written it down because it's understood. And this, you're probably doing it too, you just might not be keeping logs. So basically, you're just going to add some of the documentation components, and you're there. So hopefully what you've already learned today makes a food safety plan not quite as daunting as what you might have thought before you come in. We hope. Okay, with that, we're going to pass out some handouts, and we're going to go through a couple of exercises to get you started on this process. Just a copy of the agenda of the stuff that we're talking about on the front. Then developing a food safety plan, map out your operation, identify your risks, some of the stuff we talked about, and then general considerations. And we'll get into that in a little bit of detail after she passes this stuff out. And then the exercises that we're going to go through here, we've got the same exercises in here, but with answers already, so that if you kind of miss part of this because you're thinking or asking questions, when you get out of here, you can go, oh yeah, I remember that. You didn't have to write it down. But don't cheat, okay? Because we're on film. We have a glossary of terms, okay?
Can you answer any questions on?
And then the back page is basically some food safety resources, some of the general stuff. Guys, this list is about a tenth of what you can find in about 2 minutes in a search engine too. It's some of the most predominant things that people are using today. Okay, kind of what we're going to do is this is going to be two things. Whenever you identify some type of risk assessment, these are the components that are typically identified as areas where you need to consider if that's going to be a risk or not. So for example, like I'm going to pick a field to grow my produce in this month. What is my water supply? That's huge. Is it surface or is it well? So that's a component we need to look at. Soil amendments, obviously it's the field we're going to grow it in. That growing medium is going to be important. Worker health and hygiene. Component, but maybe not as big because it's probably only going to be 1 or 2 people. Okay? Sanitary facilities, not an issue at all in this because the guy's just going to be in the tractor for 3 hours and he's got access to a bathroom. Field sanitation, the same thing. Packing facility, it's not, it's a field. Transportation, a little bit of a component there because what happens if he gets a leak in the transmission of the tractor or something like that. And trace back, the only component I got to think about there is how do I identify that field and the product I'm going to put into it. So we've identified like 4 things if he's picking a field that we need to go into depth and see what we're going to do. And we're going to run a practice on this, so don't get too worried if you miss something. And then here's, sorry, I forgot my microphone. This is just a real kind of general example of mapping out your production processes. You guys do it any ways that's easy for you, but have some kind of flow chart or actual pictures, aerial maps of your fields and your water supply system to begin your risk assessments. And then you'll just pick an area that you're working on, and then you'll have these components that come into it that'll dictate what you do. Okay? So basically, the first one, we're going to do a real general one with this picture here, and then we'll get more in depth on the next one.
So if everyone has that little map, this was a little exercise developed by the University of Florida, hence the reason why there's citrus groves in it, which doesn't necessarily apply to around here, but I think with this very basic activity kind of gets the wheels turning in your head as to when you are on your farm, all the different things that you might want to think about. So take a look at the picture, and underneath each one of these areas is labeled as to what it is. So 1 is surface water source for irrigation. 2 is overhead irrigation piping. 3 is up here, it's some sort of unmanaged forest. 4 is a compost heap. 5 is a wash station, and 6 is this grove. So try to kind of take into account where these things are located in accordance to one another. So what do you think would be the issue right here with number 1? Does anybody have any ideas? Yeah, what are these guys doing? These guys are up on a hill. What happens when it rains? Right down the hill into that pond. These people are irrigating from that pond. That's a risk. What do you think about number 2, overhead irrigation piping? I know we haven't talked specifically about this, but think about how you apply water. How do you, just yell out how do you guys apply your water? Drip.
Spray, mist.
Spray, mist. Some might be doing flood irrigation. Now, if you're doing it overhead, is it contacting that produce directly? Yeah. If you're sprinkling on water overhead, likely it's contacting the part of the produce that you are going to be eating. So what happens if these cows are up here, it rains, and then we overhead irrigate? Whatever was in that pond from those cows is now all over our produce. So it goes back to that water source and trying to reduce these risks that are coming into play there. Number 3, unmanaged forests. This is kind of a touchy subject. If you guys are familiar with the word co-management, there's a real big focus on making sure that what food safety practices you do is not disrupting the natural environment. So in this exercise that they developed, they proposed that the unmanaged forest might draw in some unwanted animals like deer, and that you should appropriately manage that risk by, putting your scarecrows out or doing something so that you're not drawing in animals that might be walking through your field. But there's a fine line between what you should be doing to manage your land and the natural habitat. How about number 4? Anybody have any ideas about the heap and where it's located?
It's too close to the wash station.
Yeah, it's right next to where you're washing your produce. What happens if we got a windy day? And don't tell me you guys don't have windy days, because I flew in here to the Denver airport and my plane was going like this. I mean, that's a direct risk right there. You can see that with your plain eyes. You're walking around your farm. Something should be turning in your head saying something about that's not right. So 5, the vegetable wash station, where is it located? Right next to the compost heap. And I think 6, they put that in there as a little spoiler. Like, that's not really an issue. I don't know, just to trick you guys. I mean, it's just a citrus grove. You might have some animals that would be in that location, but I think it's just to trick you. But
so I have a quick question on the water piece of it.
Yeah.
So is there something that the grower can use that would give them the potability, the water potability, test, 1, and then 2, if you're irrigating and the water has a little bit of E. coli and it gets introduced into the plant through the stem, does the plant will actually eat or kill the E. coli? So really it's just a surface contaminant. So can you have, if the water is contaminated with E. coli OH157, can it survive systemically? Because I know it can surface.
Yes. So let me, just so that people on this video know, number 1, your first question is testing? Yeah. How do we know it's there? Okay, so yeah, as part of an audit, you'll be required to show that you've gotten your water tested. And
how often do you have to test the water?
I'll let Tracy answer that because he's got the specifics.
Basically, what you're going to want to do is you're going to talk to your research specialists that identify that crop as one of their expert areas, and they're going to tell you what would be acceptable as far as water quality. And then you've got to prove that you can meet those qualifications. Well, how do I do that? I just bought this ranch or citrus grove, I guess you would, in Florida. I don't know a darn thing about it, so I find out from the professionals what they know, and then I don't have any baseline. So what I'm going to do is pre-harvest, I'm going to test this water just to see what I have. Okay? I'm going to compare that to the model that the research specialists or the gap resources that I found show me is good, and then I know whether I need to do anything else, okay? Then let's say everything was good in that, so I go ahead and apply it to my product. During the growing season, I'm going to test it again, and I'm going to see where I'm at. And then just before harvest, I'm going to do it again. What you're going to do is the first few times you do this, you may pull 20 water samples to know what your baseline numbers are, how that compares to good agricultural practices as identified by the resources that you're using, that we talked about. And if you ever fall below those, then you're going to take mitigation steps. Maybe, okay, I know I got some issues here, so I'm going to put a filtration system right here. Okay? Or I'm going to chlorinate, or I'm going to use an antibacterial wash, or something. And again, use your resource people to tell you what those tools are that you have, because they may know stuff that you have no ideas out there. Okay? But you're going to want to pull those validation tests to see what you got, and then just to monitor it during that period of time. And then once you, let's say you do this for 2 years and you pulled 50 water tests those first 2 years, you've never had a problem, you need to do a risk analysis and go, okay, well, with the information I have, I'm going to drop that down to 1 test before I start growing, maybe 1 test while I'm growing, and maybe 3 tests leading up to the weeks of harvest. Because time is a critical component in a lot of bacterial management, and bacteria can live a long time in certain situations, but in other situations, the time just mitigates that risk. Not that it's not a risk, but it's a lot lower than it would have been. So you're going to want to set those baselines. So, and water, guys, water quality, once you figure that piece out for your operation, you're a long way down the road, because the other components are very easily handled, as is water, if you know what to do. But you got to use those resources, and that's where the extension specialists will really help you.
What's an average potability test cost?
You know, some states are giving them away. Some labs do it as a promotional thing to get more business. Mostly what we hear, microbial contamination only. We're talking like total coliform tests, anywhere from $10 to $25.
Yeah, the ones
typically
that we offered via our webinar were about $25 to $30 a piece.
Could these guys like take it to CSU?
Yes, CSU water.
Yeah. And you can look on the internet for water testing labs and see what their criteria is, cost. I mean, they share all of that with you. But a very easy thing to do. But like I said, water's on everything, so that's a vector for a lot of bacterial contamination. So once you get that component taken care of, then you're a long ways down the road.
It seems that one of the challenges in this whole process is this misconception that you can either have bacterial contamination or you have no bacteria. There's always bacteria, and the question is whether it's the right kind of bacteria or the wrong kind. And so, you know, it's almost like we give this impression that what we're trying to do is eradicate all these pathogens of this particular type, when in fact you can't.
Right.
So it feels like there's subtleties to this that we're not really...
There are, but you can address them in your food safety plan. The subtlety would be, you know, maybe you've got Tracy's big box service who wants to buy your product, okay? And I'm saying, I want perfect everything on your score of your test of an audit, okay? And one of those things is, were there any microbial contaminants identified through the water test? And what you just said is exactly right. That's impossible. And let's say you're growing a root crop, for example, and you have no total coliforms, so obviously you have no E. coli or salmonella issues either. But maybe maybe something else shows up on there it's a root crop. It probably doesn't matter. That's where your extension specialist or the good agricultural practices that are identified should be able to back that up. That's when you give me that audit, you can say, hey, my water test didn't come back perfect, but here's the research behind that it doesn't create a problem with that crop. Okay? So, and those tools are out there. That's what these universities do. Gretchen can talk a lot more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some specific pathogens that you would be concerned about, E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, all those ones. But you're right, we're not trying to create a sterile environment. And I think that's important for growers to know, and people that work with growers, is there's no way to create a sterile environment. It's outside, it's dirty, it's dirt. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
And going back to this example, it's tree fruit, and it looks like we're flood irrigating for the most part right here, all of this type of stuff. So it never comes in contact with the edible portion of the plant. So I go to my research extension specialist and I go, what would be acceptable for the systemic issues and issues that, you know, that you would consider there? And they say, hey, you know, as long as you meet recreational water standards of this parts per million, you should be good to go. That's what you use as that basis. So as long as your tests are underneath that, you're good. But you guys have to understand, we go back to that thing, share that with those buyers that are having you do this. Because it gives them more insight onto what they're doing, and maybe, you know, tree fruit, we're way too tight on tree fruit. So we've got these rules in place, but let's decrease it for tree fruit to this standard. You know, they'll get them specific, because again, they need your product, so.
Yeah, and to answer your second question, I believe was about, can pathogens be taken up through the root of a plant? They've done a lot of studies, and it's 0 to no risk. If you were to flood irrigate, obviously, if you knew your water source was contaminated, you wouldn't want to be applying that because of splash or whatever. But it's very unlikely that you would have that pathogen come up through the root. Now, if you're spraying and it's directly contacting the fruit, or even, you know, potentially on the leaves that would be harvested with it, then that's the concern.
Wasn't there earthbound issue in California systemic?
No. It was surface contaminant.
Yeah, it was all surface.
I thought it was the pigs that were furrowing in the field, and it got into the inside of the plant.
Oh, and the spinach?
The spinach, yeah.
I'm sure the fecal contamination was an issue, but that would have been, it's not taken up by the plant, you know that.
It got transferred into the packing ship.
Yeah, probably on someone's shoes or.
Yeah, that was the thing.
Yeah.
Is bacterial the only thing you're worried about as far as the water source? Because most of Pueblo County's water for irrigating plants is off of the ditch that flows from the steel.
Yeah. So that's a timely question. His question is about, are we only concerned about the bacterial and microbiological quality of the water? In GAPS, we don't include tests for chemical contaminants, but I work with a lot of growers that were hit by Hurricane Irene. They had major contamination issues with the flooding events that they had. So if that's something on your farm that you think might be a risk, get it tested. Go get your water tested for, you know, whatever contaminant you think might be present that would heavy metals, chemicals, petrochemicals, that type of stuff, but it's not addressed specifically in GAPS because that's a unique case. It's very unlikely that water sources are going to have that type of thing in it.
The easy way to address that is to go back to your baseline. You don't know what you have, pull a full water test. It'll cost you probably $125, but get all of that stuff checked, see what you have. And if you have no issues with that, and you can compare that to standards in the EPA water guide, and you can say, hey, I have no issues.
Can we use other sources of water and pull samples? Like one of the water suppliers in our area pulls water out of this ditch during the summer months. I'm sure they run raw water samples from all their testing, you know, their treatment parameters.
Sure, to a certain extent, yeah. I mean, an example of what you're talking about is I'm on a municipal water source. They're pulling samples all the time that are way more detailed than I'm ever going to need to know. You can absolutely use that. But also do your risk assessment and go, what changes though from where he's pulling his sample to where I'm using the product? If there's a risk there that you assign with that, like for example, the cows on the hill, after his test, you'd probably want to get another test just to verify that it's still good at that point. Okay. Kind of back to this question, you mentioned hydroponics. There's still some issues out there regarding the science behind, do you transfer microbial contaminants in a hydroponic situation? Again, it looks like more than likely not, but that science is still ongoing. We're still looking. So that's another whole issue because there's no way for that microbial contaminant to be, how would you say, mitigated, like by a soil or some other means, because it's going right on the plant, so that plant's absorbing it. And specifically, I'm talking sprouts, green onions, things like that. There's no other place for it to go, so how is it not in the plant? Now, science has shown that it typically uses what it needs and it discards the rest, but that's way outside of my ability to know. So you'll want to touch base with your science experts on that, especially in that situation.
All right, do we want to move on to the next exercise? Okay, so Tracy mentioned this whole idea of gaps shouldn't be that scary because you're already doing probably 90%, 95% of, the practices that are included in gaps. You just need to document them and develop an SOP. So we're going to walk you through a little exercise, and this is a log. This is a log sheet specifically for workers to clean harvest tools, which is an important thing if you're out there in the field and you're cutting produce and you're sticking things in the soil. It's important to clean those things. So what we have on this log sheet, and I'll give you some resources at the end, all these log sheets are available for download on Cornell GAP's website, but there's also a whole bunch of other places where you can get log sheets like this one. But it's simple. I mean, you've got a date, you got the question, what was cleaned? Was it a trowel, a harvest bin? That's an important one if you're like a small grower and you're going out with those big plastic bins. What are you cleaning? Did you disinfect it? You'd probably want to write down what you used. Any comments? The clippers will need sharpening soon. I mean, that's just kind of a best management practice for your farm, for your workers to let you know, hey, this piece of equipment needs to be sharpened. This piece of equipment's falling apart. Maybe we should consider, checking it. And then who did it? So AP, just write your initials. And then whoever's reviewing these documents would, at the end of the day or the end of the week, sign it. But what I want to point out about record keeping and produce safety plans is don't write anything in your plan that you can't feasibly do. If you write in your plan and say, we're going to go check the bathrooms hourly, are you going to go check your bathrooms hourly to make sure they're clean? No, I wouldn't go check my bathrooms. Set schedules that work for you and use your log sheets to show that you're doing those things, because one of the immediate failures is falsification of records for an audit. An auditor doesn't want to come on and see that you've just scribbled, it's very clear that you've just scribbled the same things in preparation for your audit and just check them off. You got to create a culture of food safety and actually implement these things. And it doesn't fall just on one person. This whole log sheet keeping thing, you pick people. You communicate with your workers or whoever is helping you out on the farm, hey, you're going to be in charge of this sheet. I want you to make sure that we fill this out and turn it into me at the end of the week. It doesn't and it shouldn't fall on one person. I just want to stress that. Do you have anything to add?
The main thing of what she's saying, guys, is that's part of your risk assessment. If she's talking about checking the bathrooms, if that could be a source of contamination in a packing line, maybe, for an example. Well, first of all, let's get that baseline information again. Let's have somebody check it every hour. And they're coming back to your employees will tell you guys know, or you'll know, man, that was worthless. Why was I over there every hour? Can't I do something else? Well, you're going to know that's not, well, let's check it every day. Okay, let's get a baseline of, after 2 days, we got to clean it at least every 2 days. Okay, so there's your baseline. So then you come up with a policy that's going to address that every other day we're going to clean the bathroom. Okay? So what I want to do now is, Gretchen kind of gave you the answers to the exercise we were going to run. So let's just
give it an example.
Let's make one up. We handed out those kind of 2 loose sheets. They're basically blank. Let's just identify, Gretchen, give us an example of like an area that we want to do a risk assessment on. You guys identify the risks. Let's write a couple of policies and see what questions are generated from that. And hopefully if we did a good job, there won't be any questions. But if there is, we'll address them while we're here. But you can kind of get into that whole kind of idea of a risk assessment. So can you pull something off of the picture, or do we just want to make one out of here?
The number 1, the pond. The pond?
Oh yeah, pick water.
Yeah, water's but might as well go big or go home. So.
Okay, let's identify, the pond is the water, so we're going to check our water. This is our, let's say this is our plot. What crop are we going to grow right here? Let's pick a crop.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Nice. Okay, let's say watermelons. Okay? So we're going to, let's say we've got watermelons here. This is our water supply. Let's say it's a drip irrigation method. And we've got plastic liners in the field with mulch under it that the melons are actually growing not in contact with the soil. Okay? But we're talking about just the water. That's our risk assessment. Now there's about 30 things we could go into that, but we're just talking number one. So take a couple of minutes and identify a few of the risks. And then probably the easiest way to do this is we'll talk about those risks first, then we'll take a couple of minutes and talk about what I could do to mitigate those risks, and then we'll do a couple practice SOPs. Okay?
So just jot some risks that you have in mind, and then we'll go on to trying to fill out one of the SOP sheets.
And I'm going to put this general consideration list back up here. Because think about how that affects that reservoir of water. I mean, I'll give you a hint. This one probably doesn't matter, so you don't need to worry about that. Okay? Water, the one we're working on. Soil amendments, manure, compost, biosolids. Would that be an issue? More than likely. So that's to get you started. And we'll just take a couple of minutes, so it won't be all inclusive, but it'll kind of give you an idea of that thought process. And this is where we wish this class was like 10 hours, because then we could get into specifics and really help you in your real life world. But if you're new to this, this will just at least get those juices flowing, hopefully.
Tracy, to set up a GAP plan, do you as the state or the CSU offer like a preliminary audit? We come in and look at it and say, okay,
we can.
This is what's working and this is what isn't going to work for you?
Yeah, we can. What I would suggest there, though, is start with a self-audit.
Right.
Get somebody else within your organization to do that. And then if that looks good, then think about, and this is where, I know it's going to mess you guys up because you're supposed to be working, but one of the things that comes up all the time with me is, man, I'm a little grower. I've got to now have an audit done. I checked into that. That's $1,600. They're going to put me out of business. The cost of it all. Well, talk to the guy that you're selling to or whoever's going to buy your product and see if they don't have a system already in place where they may send somebody in and do what's called an internal audit. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But they can save you a lot of money if they know what they're talking about and what they want. They can come in and do an internal audit at very little or no cost to you and see what your process looks like. Or you can talk to a third-party audit company such as us or any of the for-profit companies.
I think the one thing that Tracy didn't stress enough right now is that all of the audit materials, they're online. It's not like a big surprise when you decide to have an audit done. You can go do self-audits. Every single check sheet is online. So we really encourage growers to pull those down and call somebody if they have a question. Like, hey, what does this mean? What is this? How do I do this?
Is there any particular website that's really simplified it and made it, that you would recommend that's like the easiest to follow?
For an audit?
No, I would talk to the companies who are going to require you to be certified and see who they accept, and then use that one to test your system. But remember, guys, the scary part there is we're not building this safety plan to pass the audit necessarily, okay? That's that quandary that we start to get into. It's like, now I'm so involved with that audit, I see the checklist, I'm like, oh, I'm not doing that, I'm not doing that. You forget the whole point of having a food safety plan. Don't do that, okay? And we'll get into that a little bit more.
You said that the HACCP and the GAP is completely two different things, which I understand it is, but I've got some people asking for HACCP plans. Will a GAP cover a HACCP plan, or is that something?
Are you processing? Are you like cutting?
Somewhat, yes.
Well then, yeah, HACCP. Yeah.
If you're a raw agricultural commodity would be what GAPS would cover, something that hasn't been cut open in any way or processed in any way.
Process form, GAP will cover it, and once it becomes a process form.
Once it becomes a process, then it moves into HACCP. Yeah. All right, I think we've
So
hopefully
if you're
given.
harvesting directly from the field, packaging in the field, that's just GAP.
That's GAP. Yeah. If you were harvesting and then sending it on to be cut apple slices for McDonald's or whatever, that would be HACCP because you're cutting into the product and there's all different things introduced.
Is that HACCP audits also with, can you do that as a state or you just do GAP?
We just do GAP.
Gary, is there anybody in the state that does HACCP?
No, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys. There's a lot
I
of
gotta think it's a
Within the-
for-profit
within
company.
the state of Colorado?
No, it's an FDA situation.
Okay.
Yeah, and that would be typically part of your facilities inspection is when they would ask for your HACCP plan. So, all right, does anybody have any specific risks that they identified with the scenario that we pointed out? Just if you're willing to share. And we talked about some of them.
Contamination possibilities in the cows.
Yeah, so then the cows on the hill.
Brian, I was in there, are you done with it?
Those are good.
Or electrolyzed water.
I took water above them and three.
Well, yeah, well, what's up there? The nuclear power plant? I mean,
I took water first. but
you want to do that? So how are we going to mitigate that risk of what might be in there? What's the easiest way to start that whole process? We're going to do a water test, right? Okay, so we've identified the process that we're going to do. Okay, so we would document that. But now how would we document that? Okay, that'll keep a record of our test and who pulled it and where it was pulled from, right? That'll be the next step. But like the question I'm thinking is how many water tests do we need? Well, you want to go find out what is acceptable for this melon crop we're going to grow first. Okay, so we're going to talk to our CSU extension specialists over in the Arkansas Valley, and Mike's going to tell us, hey, it's 126 parts per million per milliliter. Okay, so we get a water test that comes back and it's 0. How much? 127? Okay, going to make this difficult because we only got 3 minutes left. Okay, so it's 127. What are we going to do to mitigate that risk? Because we got a problem. What's that? That's, yeah. Coming from the hydroponics guy, there's the easy answer. Okay, so yeah, you could do that. You could filter it.
Filtration system covered, if it will, that's fine. If not, then you got to.
Well, here's kind of a question that we kind of missed. Where did we pull the water sample from? If we pull it here, does it really matter? How about let's pull it here as it comes out of the drip line?
What happens between the water source?
It could dissipate.
It could.
Right.
It could.
Or something else could be introduced.
Or yeah. But I would want to, in my SOPs, I want to identify that we want to test our water during the growing season weekly, maybe. This is my first year. I've never grown melons before, just to get a baseline. I'm going to compare it to that standard that the research specialist gave me, and we're going to log it on a sheet like what we showed in the example. But we're going to, on that sheet, we're going to want to have, kind of like what she had, the date that the water sample, and then I'm going to want to put where was that water sample pulled from. Okay, and then maybe results and see attached and have an actual copy of that. And on there, it's going to have all the information that you just had, plus it'll have the lab so that it could always go back to a lab. Because it could be a situation where you got a false water test. I mean, they make mistakes too. We've seen that before. I've had growers call me and go, Trace, I'm done. Just cancel the audit. I'm like, why? I said, my water test came back. We can't even be living within 500 miles of this. I'm like, what? And it'll be a mistake they made at the lab. So, but you've got that documentation, so you can, hey man, I need to pull another water test. This isn't right.
Yeah, this is out of whack.
Okay. Does that give you guys an idea? We want to try and finish this, so we're kind of hurrying up. But does that? We didn't have as much time in the kind of hands-on as we hoped, but hopefully you kind of get an idea.
Implementation, train your employees. The biggest thing here is now you have a plan in place, share that plan with your employees. Then they'll know, they'll have buy-in. It's like, hey, that's an important consideration with the risk that's identified and those mitigation things that we're going to do. So train them, perform internal or self-party or third-party audits. And remember, guys, if cost is an issue there, and I think it's really important that you talk to the people who are working with you on the retail side or the institution side that's going to take your product to see what those expectations are, because maybe they can help you with reducing that cost by telling you who can do the audit. You want to evaluate the audit results and implement the corrective actions. Guys, this is huge, and I hope if you don't get anything else out of this, is that audit is not the be-all, end-all. It's not a guarantee. Okay? It's like the gauges in your car. A car is a very complex machine of a lot of different components that are working together. Our water gauge and our oil gauge are going to tell us way before we have a catastrophic condition with our car that it's going to break down.
Weekly and daily records is what's key, right?
What's that?
Weekly and daily records is what's key.
Absolutely, because that shows that you're doing it every day too. But that indication will tell me, you know what, I need to check the oil in my car because my oil pressure is like 0 or something's up before you ruin the engine. That's what an audit is for. And then you take those results and you implement corrective actions to your plan to say, hey, that's how I fix this hole. Update the plan as needed. If you change a process like a water source, in our example we used a reservoir. Let's say we go to a well out in the middle of the field that goes into the confined aquifer, let's say. Whole different component. Or we decide, hey, I'm not even messing with all that. I'm going to join this guy and be a hydroponic in a greenhouse where I can control the environment. You know, but I'm changing those processes. You need to start the whole risk assessment over again, okay? Understand you've got to do that to make sure you mitigate the risks associated with that. Crisis management, we talked a little bit about that on communication. Daily, guys, get the word out of what you do. Share those plans with people so they know what your processes are. Guys, the consumers from the retailers on, they're real concerned about where their food comes from and how it's grown, but they don't have a clue about what you guys do. So do some proactive stuff to build those reputations so that you know what's going on. And in an event of a crisis, before you start to defend what you do, make sure you're compassionate about what happened. You know, if it's just a test that they pulled on a residual chemical at the inline, you can address that with your food safety plan, with your research people at CSU saying that's not a problem. But if people get sick, or heaven forbid they die, keep that in consideration before you start to defend your product. Not that you can't, and have a plan in place prior to. One thing I really like to stress, and we don't have time to cover it in this class, but have a lot of this stuff ready prior to a crisis. So you never use it. Right on. Good for you guys. But if you do have to use it, guys, that call from a reporter is going to happen at 11 o'clock on Friday night after you get back from a football game with your sons. And it's going to be a guy from the New York Times wanting to know, how come you made 40 people sick? Have a couple of comments in place to be ready for that and practice that. And that goes a long way of keeping that trust built. Okay? Yeah.
I just want to go over a couple of the resources. In the very back of your packet, we listed some resources. That's certainly not all of them. There are a ton of resources specifically for writing food safety plans, and those are just some of the ones that we would suggest as a higher priority. I've also brought some of the Cornell materials. We've got a ton of stuff online. Most of it's available. All those record-keeping sheets are available to download online. I also brought a template of a food safety plan that we use in New York trainings to work directly with growers. If you want to see kind of what things should be in a food safety plan, come see me afterwards. But we've also given you some resources that you can look online.
One thing that's exciting, guys, is this time last year, there wasn't a lot of stuff out there as far as templates and things for you to use. So you'd get just a taste of it from what we showed you last year, and then you couldn't find anything on it, so you were still lost. Where today, you know, put food safety plan development or something in a search engine, or use these resources specifically that we're giving you in the back of your workbook, and they'll go, I mean, it's the whole gamut. There will be 50 different templates. Just word of caution, make sure it fits what you guys do, okay?
And I have two other things. One is just a flyer for the produce safety lines. The best way to keep up to date about trainings and educational materials would be sign up for a general listserv. And I send out emails like once a month, but it'll give you a good idea if you're looking for educational materials or you're looking to train other people, what we've got going on right now.
So I'm going to go back to something you asked a while ago about, are there classes you can take for this? Julia talked about it a little bit at the introduction, is I'm going to partner with her and we're going to go to Weld County, to the West Slope, to the Arkansas Valley area in March, it looks like, and do a class like this, but a 4-hour class where we can actually, you guys can take components as producers of exactly what you know and start to build a food safety plan. If you're interested in something like that, please watch for that and attend that. But in the meantime, what I would do is try and start one. You know, use the templates that we're giving you out of the resources and start one. And then when you come to a class like that, you can ask specific questions as opposed to these real general ones. So we can get you, you know, we get only so much time with you guys, and it's like, man, I wish I could have asked Trace 100 more questions, but I'm not there. So
do you have a set date for the Arkansas Valley?
We don't know any of it yet. Although I do know for this presentation, it's going to happen again next week at the Arkansas Valley Farm, Ranch, and Water Symposium. And then sometime in March they'll have the 4-hour, like this, but expanded to 4 hours where you get more hands-on classroom type stuff. So I don't know.
The one next week is just like this.
Yeah.
Will you guys video that presentation?
My guess would be, yeah. I'm sure Julia, that's her modus, so yeah, I'm sure. And hopefully what we're going to see is we can get, by kind of what the thought is on these 4-hour classes that are coming up, is to give you an opportunity to get started as a grower. And then I think what she's going to try and do is sometime in the fall after the harvest season, have another class to where you can actually come in and after you've ran a food safety plan maybe for a year, or at least parts of it, you can come in and go, man, you know, I did this, but we never talked about this issue. How do I handle that? So, but please use your extension specialist to start as a resource. They can help you a lot, guys. Well, hopefully if we taught you guys anything and you get down the right road, you'll never have to talk to New Zealand.